Hello, Assalamualaikum. I am Madam Pensyarah. I am here because I want to talk about absolute value. Let's get started. Absolute values. Learning outcome. At the end of the lesson, students should be able to define absolute values, state and use the properties of absolute values. Absolute value is falls between two vertical lines. For example, absolute value -4. Actually, absolute value -4 is the distance unit from 0 to -4. And the distance from 0 to -4 is 4 unit. Meaning that absolute value -4 is equal to 4. Definition absolute values. The absolute value of A can be defined as A if A more than or equal to 0, negative A if A less than 0. And also, absolute value of A is equal to square root of A square. Let's look at example 1. Define the following absolute value. For question A, absolute value of x plus 1. For question B, absolute value of 2 minus x. In order to define the absolute value, we use the definition. Absolute value of A is equal to A if A is more or equal to 0. Negative A if A less than 0. Okay, for question A, we define absolute value x plus 1. We follow the definition. Then we get the first one, x plus 1 if x plus 1 more or equal to 0. And then the second one, negative in bracket x plus 1 if x plus 1 is less than 0. Okay. So, jadi kita ikut definition absolute value of A, then kita dapat ada dua kat sini. The first one is x plus 1 and then the second one is negative x plus 1. Okay. And then seterusnya, kita kena simplify domain yang bahagian belakang. So, jadi ini kita kena jadikan x sebagai subjek. Okay. So, then for x plus 1, okay, we simplify x plus 1 more or equal to 0. Then we get x more or equal to negative 1. And then for negative x plus 1, we also simplify. We get negative x minus 1. If, and this one x plus 1 less than 0, we simplify, we get x less than negative 1. So, akhirnya kita dapat definition of x plus 1. Absolute value of x plus 1 is equal to x plus 1 if x more or equal to negative 1. And then negative x minus 1 if x less than negative 1. Now, let's look at the solution for question B. We want to define absolute value 2 minus x. Sama seperti question A, kita akan define B, question B, absolute value 2 minus x. We follow the definition. And then the first one, we get 2 minus x if 2 minus x more or equal to 0. And then the second one is negative in bracket 2 minus x if 2 minus x less than 0. Okay. Satu positif, satu negatif. Okay. And then we need to simplify the domain yang belakang ni. Kita kena simplify. So, maksudnya 2 minus x more or equal to 0 ni kita kena simplify sehingga dapat x. Sama juga dengan 2 minus x less than 0. Okay. And then, For 2 minus x, we simplify 2 minus x more or equal to 0. Then we get negative x more or equal to negative 2. And then negative 2 minus x, we simplify, we get negative 2 plus x. If this one negative x less than negative 2. And then dekat belakang ni, dia masih ada negatif x. So, kita kena bahagi negatif. Bila bahagi negatif, tanda inequality akan bertukar. So, finally, we get definition of absolute value of 2 minus x is 2 minus x if x less or equal to 2, negative 2 plus x if x is more than 2. So, this is the final answer. Let's see properties of absolute value. Okay, we have 6 properties of absolute value. The first one, absolute value of A is more or equal to 0. For example, absolute value of 3, this is equal to 3, which is 3 is a number is more or equal to 0. Let's say we have example absolute value negative 5. This is equal to 5, which is also more or equal to 0. Now, let's see number 2, properties number 2. Absolute value of A is equal to absolute value negative A. For example, we have absolute value of 4, which is equal to 4. And then absolute value of negative 4 is also equals to 4. Then finally, absolute value of 4 is equal to absolute value of negative 4. We can conclude that absolute value of 4 sama dengan absolute value of negative 4. The third one, absolute value of A tambah B, A plus B is equal to absolute value B plus A. So, for example, we have absolute value 1 plus 2. This is equal to absolute value of 3, which is equals to 3. If we find absolute value 2 plus 1, then we also get absolute value of 3, which is equals to 3. Then we can conclude that absolute value of 1 plus 2 is equal to absolute value 2 plus 1. The fourth one, absolute value of A minus B is equal to absolute value B minus A. For example, absolute value 5 minus 3. This is equal to absolute value of 2, which is equal to 2. If we find absolute value 3 minus 5, we get absolute value negative 2. Then, absolute negative 2 is also 2. Then, we can conclude that absolute value 5 minus 3 is equal to absolute value 3 minus 5. And then, the fifth property is absolute value A multiplied by B is equal to absolute value of A multiply absolute value of B. For example, if we have absolute value negative 3 times 2, let's say, this is become absolute value negative 6, which is equals to 6. If we want to find absolute value of negative 3 multiply absolute value of 2, this is absolute value of negative 3 is 3 multiply absolute value of 2 is 2. So then we get 6. So then we can conclude that absolute of negative 3 times 2 is equal to absolute value negative 3 multiply absolute value of 2. The last one, absolute value A over B is equal to absolute value of A divided by absolute value of B. with condition absolute value of B does not equal to 0. So, kat bawah denominator cannot be 0. So, this one, for example, absolute value, let's say we have 9 divided by negative 3. This is actually absolute value of negative 3. Then we get 3. If we find absolute value of 9 divided by absolute value of negative 3, then we get absolute value of 9 is 9 divided by absolute value of negative 3 is 3. Then we get 9 divided by 3 is 3. Finally, we get 3. Then we can conclude that absolute value of 9 divided by negative 3 is equal to absolute value of 9 divided by absolute value of negative 3. Let's look at example 2. Evaluate the following absolute values. Question A, absolute value of 3. For question B, absolute value of negative 5. For question C, absolute value negative 10 plus 3. For question D, absolute value of 8 minus 7. And for question E, absolute value of negative 27 over 3. And the last one, question F, absolute value of 4 multiply absolute value of negative 5. Now let's see the solution for example 2. For this example, we want to evaluate the absolute value. For question A, absolute value of 3. Since absolute value of 3 is the distance unit from 0 to 3, which is equals to 3. So then absolute value of 3 is equal to 3. Okay, so maksudnya kat sini absolute value of 3 maksudnya adalah jarak daripada 0 ke 3. 0 ke 3 jaraknya 3. Jadi absolute value of 3 sama dengan 3. Sama juga dengan question B. Absolute value of negative 5, maksudnya dia adalah distance unit from 0 to negative 5, which is equal to 5. So then absolute value of negative 5 is equal to 5. For question C, absolute value negative 10 plus 3, this is absolute value negative 10 plus 3, we get negative 7. So then absolute value of negative 7 is equal to 7. Okay. And then for question D, absolute value 8 minus 7. This is absolute value 8 minus 7 is 1. Then absolute value of 1 is equal to 1. For question E, absolute value negative 27 over 3. There are two alternatives to evaluate absolute value negative 27 over 3. The first alternative, okay, cara yang pertama, absolute negative 27 over 3, kita simplify, kita bahagi negative 27 bahagi 3, akan dapat negative 9. Then, we get absolute negative 9. And then, absolute of negative 9 is equal to 9. Then we get absolute value negative 27 over 3 is equal to 9. Itu adalah cara yang pertama. Atau cara yang kedua, absolute negative 27 over 3 is equal to, kita boleh pecah kepada absolute value negative 27 divide by absolute value of 3. And then, absolute value of negative 27 is equal to 27 divided by absolute value of 3 is equal to 3. Then we divide 27 by 3, then we get equals to 9. Okay, so jadi awak boleh pilih mana-mana salah satu cara. At the end awak akan dapat jawapan yang sama. Untuk soalan F, absolute value of 4 multiply absolute value of negative 5. So this one, absolute value of 4 is 4 absolute value of negative 5 is 5. So then 4 multiplied by 5. Then we get 20.
That's all for today. Thank you. Bye. See you.